You're listening to episode 319 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Oren J. Sofer joins us to speak about Say What You Mean, a mindful approach to nonviolent communication. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page. And if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. Communication is a complex interaction. Our own perceptions are not tape recorder accurate, nor are they complete. Bias creeps into our thoughts about perceptions, and our cultural background will influence the very words we use. And that's just a taste of what goes into just one side of a conversation. When listening, we may be rehearsing what we're going to say, thinking about something completely unrelated, dismissing what the other person is saying, or perhaps we're genuinely and deeply listening, not just hearing, might miss body language cues or messaging that's important to the speaker, but not us. Mindfulness practice may help, and in particular, communicating with care. Oren J. Sofer leads retreats and workshops on mindful communication around the United States. A member of the Spirit Rock Teachers Council, he teaches the Insight Meditation community, holds a degree in comparative religion from Columbia University, and is a somatic experiencing practitioner and a certified trainer of nonviolent communication. Oren creates mindfulness training programs for apps and organizations and lives in Richmond, California. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Mandarin orange tea. Our guest today is Oren J. Sofer. Oren, welcome to the podcast. Good to meet you.
Thanks so much, Ted. Good to be here.
I also wanted to mention thanks to our mutual friend, Dave Smith, for making this connection. Thanks, Dave. OU1. And let's get started. I want to ask, Oren, how you first encountered Buddhism and meditation.
Yeah, I love talking about it just because it was such a powerful and transformative time for me in my life. I was in my late teens and going through a really hard time in college. I was using a lot of drugs, had a big falling out with the community, the circle of friends that I was connected with. The relationship had just ended. My parents were getting divorced, kind of the way in which we can go through periods in our life where it feels like everything's kind of dissolving or falling apart. So there were a number of things pointing towards India I had taken a class with a professor who was like really into India, and he had showed us all of these slides of the country, pictures he had taken, and I was just fascinated. It was so different from anything I had ever seen or any place I had ever been. And I had been doing some reading about Asian philosophy and Eastern religions and the kinds of ideas that I was being exposed to really made sense intuitively. In fact, I talk about like one of the key things that sort of pointed me in this direction was this great little book by a guy named Benjamin Hoff called The Tao of Pooh.
I remember it well.
Right. And so, I read that book and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is like saying stuff that I've kind of known to be true internally my whole life, but no one has ever said.
Right.
So when the opportunity to study abroad came in college for a semester, it was like, oh yeah, I want to go to India. It was kind of like a desire for a really big reset. And I found this program that focused on Buddhism in Bodh Gaya, which, as you know, is kind of the Mecca of Buddhism. It's kind of where the Buddha enlightened. And so, and I read about the program. So keep in mind, I was like an 18-year-old kid. College in New York City, of all places. And I read the description, and it talked about no sex, no drugs, no alcohol. Get up at 5 a.m. to meditate every morning. And I was like, sign me up. I just needed this like detox, this very super, I want to get as far away as possible from anything I've ever known and like clear the decks. And so I got over there, and as many people experience going to India for the first time, it was like huge culture shock. I was just like, what am I doing here? And it was sensory overload. A friend of mine who I was there with, also his first time there, it's a wonderful phrase, this way of putting it, that someone else had told him before he went, who had been to India. And he said, you know what India's like, man? He goes, if LSD is a postcard, India's the landscape. So, it was a lot. And I'll finish here, which is that the very first, we finally got to Bodh Gaya, and we met the two meditation teachers, both Asian, one Indian man and a Sri Lankan man. And the very first night, hearing them talk about the Dharma and meditation, it was like everything fell into place. Something inside was just like, oh, this is not only why I'm here, like, thousands of miles away in India, but like, this is why I'm here on the planet. This is what I've been waiting for. And so that was kind of a very key moment for me in my life, and things just sort of unfolded from there.
So there's another thread to our topic for today, and that is communications. So I'm wondering what specific interest in that, how did that come about?
So my first love in life was acting. I was a child actor, and I very much wanted to speak to people. I remember there's another kind of one of those weird moments or stories. I remember seeing Back to the Future. I don't remember if it was part 2 or part 3 in the 80s. And something about the movie, and, it was very poignant in the end about how, like, you try to change time, and, the life that you had is, kind of like a Christmas story, that sense of, the life that you think you want versus the life that you actually have that you're grateful for. And for whatever reason, as a like 9-year-old boy or 11-year-old boy, like it shifted something in my mind where I saw my life and appreciated things in a different way. And then I had this meta level realization of like, holy cow, I just had this realization from watching this movie that these people created, how many millions of people saw that movie and maybe had some kind of shift in their life or some new insight. I was like, I want to do that. I want to be able to touch lots of people and get them to think about something meaningful. So that was this deep motivation I had as a kid. And because that insight came through, show business and media, it was a no-brainer. Well, I'll become an actor, and that'll help me to have a platform to say something that people can hear. So that was kind of the first love of communication. But when I found the Dharma, the acting stuff fell away. It just wasn't authentic anymore. It was more about a friend of mine said to me, you went from being whoever anyone wanted you to be, to try and find out who you really are. So then through the course of my meditation practice, what I found was that the really meaningful and powerful experiences that I was having in meditation, in connecting with my heart and the universal values of kindness and compassion and stillness and peace, would evaporate as soon as there was any kind of a conflict or tension with somebody, particularly coworkers, and forget about family. It was just like, mindfulness, what's that, And so I was like, well, what's going on here? Why is this not translating? So that's when I came into contact with Marshall Rosenberg's work, who's the founder of Nonviolent Communication. And it was, again, another one of those moments of like, oh my gosh, like I've been waiting for this. This is what I need to learn. This is what I want. And it provided the communication training, provided this missing piece. It provided a bridge to translate what I was feeling and experiencing so deeply as true in my heart, in my meditation practice, into my life and my relationships.
So I want to segue a bit into this merging of Buddhist asana with right speech in particular, this communication. Sometimes Buddhist codes of behavior might seem a little bit abstract. And I'm wondering how you found right speech fits into your work in a practical way.
Yeah. I love this niche, this facet of the path. So how it fits into my work is, I'll say kind of two things in general. One is it forms the foundation of my work. And, right speech is not just about what we say, right? It includes a lot more. It's why we say it, where we're coming from, how we say it. It's when we say it. It's a very thorough training, as you know. But it even goes deeper than that. Right speech is one of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, which means that this is actually not a behavioral training. This is a training in awakening. The function of right speech, just like the function of any of the factors of the Eightfold Path, any of those path factors, the function is awakening. It's freedom. It's to free the mind. And so speech and, the faculty of speech, vajji or vacha, vajji sankara, this verbal capacity that we have, which is more than just what we say. It's also the thought realm. It's that capacity to form concepts and language sits at this very interesting juncture between the mind, the heart mind, the chitta, and phenomenal reality and our interactions and relationships, because it's kind of it mediates our relationships, and it's both formed by the mind. Our speech is shaped by our impulses, our emotions, our patterns, our habits, our experiences. But as we speak, as we engage, as we listen, as we relate, as we think, those verbal actions, that verbal karma, simultaneously reshapes and conditions our mind. So because of that place it holds in human consciousness and experience, it's a really powerful nexus to work for transformation and learning. It's like the breath in terms of meditation. The breath holds a very unique place, right? Because it bridges mind and body. It bridges the nervous system, voluntary and involuntary. So speech, which comes through breath for many of us, holds a similar place. So it shows up in my work in these two ways, just to kind of come back to where I started from and summarize it. In one, it's the foundation. Because the aim of my work, even though I work in many contexts, I work in the medical field doing training, I work with tech companies doing training, I teach meditators. The aim is always about, how do we realize our potential as human beings and free our minds, our hearts, our communities, our world from suffering. So that's one foundation. And then two, it informs the work because it's such a powerful place to train the mind and develop transformative understanding.
So let's talk a bit about the book. As of this recording just coming out,
Just wondering what are some of your favorite highlights of what's in the book?
I'll just say, just since we've been kind of, moving a little, Ted, between like the personal and the professional, and where I started, and just it's a pretty cool, unique moment for me personally. Like the book, I actually held the book for the first time yesterday. We had the first, I got home. I was just on retreat for a long time, as you know, and I just got home and I opened, opened the box, and the books are there, and it's just this very interesting kind of experience of this physical manifestation, not only of the work of the book of the last year or two of writing it and editing it, but in the last couple decades of my life and my training and my practice. So, what are some of my favorite lines or, teachings in the book? In some sense, the book as a whole is it's just, there's a deep sense of gratitude that I feel for the opportunity to just put the book out there and share it with the world, because it's just like, hey, I think this is really useful stuff for everyone. And so the book as a whole in itself feels like a favorite, if that's I could say that. Yeah, so I think one of the first points that I make in the book, that's one of my kind of foundations as a great takeaway, is just pointing out the obvious that we often miss, which is that we need to be here to communicate well. That mindfulness is an essential prerequisite for effective, meaningful conversation, right? If we're not paying attention, good luck, understanding someone else or navigating some difficulty or deepening your relationship personally or professionally. So that sense that the more we can train ourselves in the capacity, not just to be mindful and aware, but to really be embodied and stay aware in the relational space with another human being in the process of speaking and listening and interacting. And that's hard. It takes practice.
Yeah.
So that's one. A related one is this very simple point that we can all, I think, recognize when we consider it, which is that one of the key benefits of mindfulness is that the more aware we are, the more choice we have. And so that choice comes into our relationships, into our conversations. When we're able to be present, we can steer, we can navigate, we can respond more effectively because we're seeing a little bit more clearly, and so we can make choices. So that's really important. I'll mention a couple more, and then we can unpack any of these or kind of move into another terrain. I think another important one, and these are part of the book is structured around certain principles, and maybe this is one in and of itself, which I talk about in the introduction, which is that in any kind of training or learning, there's a difference between the essence or the principles and the form, the tools, the practice. And this is particularly important for communication because there are many different communication systems and with value out there. The nonviolent communication is one of those that I, am trained in and teach. Really powerful practice, but it's a form and it's limited in that it is a form. And the form points to deeper understandings and principles. So I say this over and over again when I teach, and that is that communication is not about what we say. And that any communication form or tool that you learn is not a script. And when we get attached or fixated on how do I say it and what's the right way to say it, and it should be said this way, that actually reduces the space for connection and understanding because we become rigid and we lose that capacity to be authentic and really connect with the other person and respond flexibly to what's happening. So all that to say, these principles that I'm pointing to, these are at the heart of the training. And the idea is to really learn how to embody and remember these. And that's what the form is there for, to help retrain our mind. Another one is that other people all of us want to be heard. When we speak, it's important to keep in mind, why does anyone open their mouth? So we tend to focus on what people are saying, the content. And we forget that if someone is speaking, whether that's literally speaking or sending an email or a text message, or generally, not 100% of the time, there are exceptions I won't go into, but generally, when people say something, they want to be heard. We want to be understood. And so when that is met, when we can give someone an experience of feeling heard or understood, whether or not we agree with them, whether or not we're willing to say yes or do what they're asking, that's different than hearing where someone's coming from. When we're able to give someone that experience of feeling heard and seen, they're much more likely to be willing to listen and hear where we're coming from. So that's a key kind of cornerstone of dialogue. And we all know this, but we forget it. And so we can train ourselves in dialogue to just remember that basic point and say, okay, well, let me just see if I can hear you before I say why it won't work or what I want or where I'm coming from or, why that upsets me, or like, okay, you just said something. It's going to be hard for you to hear me until you feel like that's complete, until you know that I got the message. So that's another key point. And then I'll mention one more. And these last two are kind of the core pillars. The mindfulness and presence is the foundation. And then these two pillars of actually speaking and listening. So one is the importance of helping people to feel heard. And then the other side is in terms of when we speak, when we need to say what's on our mind, where we're coming from, what's true for us. How do we find a way to say that other people can hear? So again, we want to keep in mind when we're sharing something with somebody, we want them to be able to understand it. We want them to be able to hear us. Otherwise, we wouldn't bother wasting our energy speaking to them. So instead of just, saying, well, here's what I think, and it's up to you, it's a lot to expect for other people to understand us just on their own. We want to take some of that responsibility to say, okay, I'm going to actually work to help you understand me. I'm going to try to say this in a way that's clear that you can hear. And so one of the main things that helps to do that is to find ways to speak that are non-blaming. The less blame, the less criticism in our words, the easier it is for others to hear us. And so that's, again, part of the training is to learn, well, how do I say this in a way that's authentic, that's true? I'm saying what's true for me without making it about you being wrong. Right. And that takes some work, but it's totally possible. And then others are much more able to hear what's going on for us.
I appreciated you saying a few minutes ago about communications being hard, that it is difficult. Mm-hmm. Part of this, I've found it's very helpful before breaking the group out into partners, mm-hmm. is to ask the question, think about the last time you were really heard and listened to and what that was like. And there's a moment of people who are new to this. Maybe they haven't joined a group before, for example, and there's a little bit of a, oh, yeah. Nodding. Yeah. And then to really make the point, I sometimes follow it up with, think about another time where you weren't listened to, you weren't heard, and what that was like. Uh-huh. So what we do in our conversations here is really inhabit that space of listening and giving that gift to our partner. Yeah. And that when there is a speaker and a listener, the listener is a very active role. Mm-hmm. That in fact, for many of us can be even more difficult because we're setting aside the rehearsing what we're going to say. We're setting aside the impatience at waiting for the other person to get done and things like that. And I wanted to ask you what you have found to be some of the more helpful insights for students about what they run into that may be challenging for them.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate the point you just made, that how healing it can be to feel heard. And it's I often start with a similar exercise in many of my trainings and workshops. Not only that reflection, but giving people a pointer on how to listen in that way and giving them a taste of how good it feels to be listened to and to feel heard. And everyone can do it. I'm still in the earlier part of my professional trajectory, assuming that I am able to live out my years. You never know. So, I've worked with, a few thousand people at this point, and I have yet to encounter someone who's unable to just take a very simple instruction around listening, which I'll share in a moment, and do it right away, because we all have the capacity. And without fail, people find not only is this nourishing and really, really helpful and feels good, but then the next point I make is, why don't we do this more often with each other? It's not that. In some ways, yeah, it's hard, but in other ways, it doesn't take that much more energy or effort when we remember.
So, yes, it's exercising that choice. It's remembering that we have that mindful choice.
Remembering. So on the listening side, one of the things that I really encourage is to just say, there are two instructions that I give, and for different people, different one or the other is better, is more useful. And one is just the very simple, clear instruction. Okay, just listen. Just listen with your whole being. And what often happens is, as you said, we notice all of the other impulses arise in that space. The impulse to ask a question, to give advice, to reassure, to share a story about what happened to us, to try to solve their problem, and just keep continually coming back to that space of, okay, but just listen, just be here. Just giving someone else our wholehearted, undivided attention and presence. And what's cool is that that's not only healing for the person receiving it, but it's nourishing often for the listener, as you said, and it supports samadhi. This is one of the gifts of relational practices. It sounds like you do some of that work, so I'm sure you're well aware of it, is that it is hard to stay present on our own, meditate, and particularly with the busyness of most of our lives, unless you've been at it for a long time, or are, in a time in your life where things are relatively quiet. The mind is often really busy. So we can be gone in our personal silent meditation practice for minutes on end without noticing. But if you're doing a relational practice with another human being sitting in front of you, you've got that feedback moment to moment of somebody else's eye contact and physical presence saying, hey, are you here? Are you with me? So it's a lot easier to stay present. And so that sense of really listening wholeheartedly is nourishing for the listener, because our mind begins to collect and gather, and that's, that feels good. It's nice to be here, not be so fragmented and strung out. The other instruction that I offer is to consider inside as you listen, what matters to this person? What's really important to them? Underneath the story, underneath what happened and the details, even kind of underneath how they feel, the emotions, which are important, but that's like, what really matters to this person? What are they longing for? Or what are they valuing? Maybe what do they need here? And that's another way to listen that can hold our attention. It's a kind of inquiry.
I'm wondering if there are any other things that in your working with participants in your programs and the trainings that you do, if there's anything else that tends to come up as something that they share as a challenge they run into with mindful communications.
How do I remember? That's one of the most common ones, is how do I remember? Like, all this stuff's so great, but it happens so quickly and I lose it so fast. Like, how do I remember these perspectives? How do I remember these tools? That's a really important one that comes up for people. And, there are a few things I say in response to that, or a few kind of suggestions I make. And one is the simple acknowledgement or recognition that we all have a lot of momentum and training in communication, through our society and our families and our schools. And so we're working against a lot of conditioning, and that takes time to shift. And so there's some sense of having a certain kind of respect for the process, that it takes time. And that within that, what we're looking for, and I think this is really important with not just communication, but with spiritual practice, with contemplative practice, with any kind of transformation work with complex living systems. And that means, this is from systems theory, that whether we're talking about an ecosystem or a human being or an organism, when we're dealing with complex systems, small changes can have far-reaching effects if they're sustained over time. And so what we're looking for in Dhamma practice and communication practice are small shifts that can be sustained. And when people have that understanding of like, I don't have to remember everything and do everything and, because that's a lot. No. Just take one thing that makes sense to you. So like folks listening, if there's something I've said so far that Ted said is in the conversation that, really lands for you, like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. I can do that. Great. Run with it. Every day, remember it, practice it, keep thinking about it, keep working at it until it becomes second nature. And then you take another one. So having an understanding of that process of change, incremental change, is really, really important. The other most common question and challenge that people face that I hear, and there are others if we want to continue on this vein that we can go into, but the other most common one is, Oren, this stuff's great. It makes sense. I love it. I like using it with people who are into it. But how do you do this with somebody who's not interested in, using these tools, which is most of the world, so how do I do this with my boss or, my coworker or my parent or, sometimes even my spouse who, like, every time I try to use these tools, says, stop doing that communication stuff on me, people who are resistant. And what I say is there are 2 points here that are important. The first, let's say 3 points. The first is, if these tools only worked with other people who had them or were interested, they would be intensely limited and fairly irrelevant because so few people know them or are interested in them. That's one. 2, it only takes one person to shift the dialogue, because conversation is co-created. Relationship is mutual, it's co-created. And so when one person or one factor in that dynamic co-created relationship shifts, by definition, the relationship will change. It can't be otherwise, because the relationship is comprised of how both of us are relating. Now, but what that means is that the more reactive the other person is, or the less skill level they have, the less interest they have in dialogue and working things out, the more skill level you need, right? There's an inverse relationship there between how much skill and interest the other person has and how much resilience, resource, training, and skill you need to have to shift the dialogue. And that brings me to the third point, which is that, again, and this is for the listeners out there who have been following your podcast and who are into Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy, will recognize in what I'm saying the kind of core Buddhist view of reality as being mutually conditioned. Ida Paccayata is called this. Everything is conditioned by everything else. That things exist in this net of dependent conditionality. Everything is conditioning and holding everything else in place. Nothing is there on its own independently. So we talk a lot in Buddhism about the conditions. What conditions are required for something to happen? So in conversation, what we're looking at, and this is what the book is really designed to do and to help people with, is to understand more about how do we create the conditions for more meaningful conversations. And the understanding here that I think is hard for many of us to really take in is that sometimes, far less frequently than we would believe, but sometimes the conditions aren't present for there to be the kind of transformation or understanding or connection that we're wanting. No matter how much skill we have.
Right. It's not entirely dependent on your shoulders and your skills. There's also a whole environment you're in and things that are outside of your sphere of influence.
Exactly. And so there's something kind of beautiful and deep in that, which is the very fact of this mutuality and this dependency of conditionality that makes it possible for us to use these tools and transform a situation without the other person being involved simultaneously means that it's not in our control. And we might not be able to because there are so many other conditions outside of our influence.
Yeah. And that can be perhaps the hardest thing to accept is despite one's best efforts, most heartful efforts, and most skillful efforts, things can still go kittywampus.
Exactly.
Nature of reality.
Right. But what I love about these tools and what I am so immensely grateful for in my life is that I've learned these tools within the context of contemplative practice in the Buddhist path. What's so powerful about that is that even in those situations where the conditions are not conducive to the shifts that we're hoping for, we can still work on our own relationship to that. And there can be letting go, transformation, forgiveness, and a sense of peace internally in relationship to what's happening. Yeah, and that's not just on the meditative level, that these communication skills are really, and it's really an awareness practice, and that they help us to be aware not just of our thoughts and perceptions, but of our internal experience in a different way. And they give us an additional layer of tools to translate and relate to what's happening in the mind and the heart and the body in a different way, so that in those times where we can't affect the change that we want in our life, in our world, on our planet, we have the means to work with that internally.
So I'm wondering, in all of your work and what you're currently spending time on, is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners?
You know, there are a few, maybe just a few points I want to make, and then just like an invitation for folks who are interested in what we've been talking about. So maybe just the first thing, kind of continuing with this theme of conditions. We talked about one of the primary challenges and barriers to transforming our communication and using these tools, which was the momentum that we all have in communication and we've all kind of picked up on. We've learned, language is an inherited phenomenon. We didn't create it. So we've received it not just from our parents and society, but from previous generations, right? So these very words and concepts that you and I are using to communicate now didn't come from us. So that's one barrier, is the momentum and the kind of that this is an inherited phenomenon. And another important barrier that I want to, or hurdle that I think we need to overcome, that meditators in particular are well positioned to address, but I want to name it because it's so important and so pervasive, is the context within which we live today in the modern world, where for the most part, we are living in a society that's moving at an incredibly unnatural, fast pace, that's disconnected from the body and from nature, and that is imbued with a profound fragmentation of attention. And so we are all swimming in this environment, and so our minds, our consciousness can't help but be shaped and formed and conditioned by those factors of the pace, the disembodiment, and the fragmentation of attention. And conversation and human relationship are the exact opposite. Conversation and human relationship are embodied. They're organic. It's a process that takes time and that requires attention. And so to have more meaningful, effective conversations means that we need to develop the capacity to step out of that stream of pressure that is created by the current of society. And this is why the Buddha's teachings are said to go against the stream. And why the factor of, I get the sense that, a certain segment of your audience, of the listeners out there, are kind of into Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy. So I'm kind of bringing in some of those concepts, the factor of viveka, of what's sometimes translated as seclusion, but properly means disengagement or stepping back from things is so important. We need to be able to step back from those influences and develop our own center, and really be able to hold our center within the tide of society. And that's necessary for conversation, not only, within the forces that are happening around us, but the other person, to not get pulled into someone else's energy, to, regardless of how they're relating, regardless of what they say, regardless of whatever stunts they pull, I want my behavior, I want my actions and my words, my choices to be made based on my own values, rather than coming out of reactivity to other person's behavior. I don't have to worry about their behavior. I just need to worry about my response. And so that's the training of contemplative practice, and that's another key in communication. So I wanted to share that. Wanted to share, even with all of this that we've talked about and the challenges and so forth, it really, if people only take away one thing from listening to our conversation today, I would want them to take away a sense of like, oh, I didn't realize I could actually change the way I communicate and relate to other people. The way I relate to myself, to my own mind and my own thoughts. That's like its own training. It's its own form of learning. This stuff is really accessible, even though there are barriers, even though it's hard, even though it's complicated, all that. It's really accessible. Anyone can learn how to listen a little bit better, how to speak a little bit more clearly, how to be a little bit more present and aware in our conversations and relationships. And what's so cool about that is that will affect everything in your life. Because all of us, most of us, most of us, if not all of us, probably most of the people listening to this are communicating all day long, every day, in every area of our life, even when we're alone, whether we're looking at the news or looking at our feed or just thinking. Communication it's like the currency of our life and our relationships. And our relationships are so important. Our relationships, the quality of our relationships to a large degree determines the quality of our life, the quality of our happiness, the quality of our professional success, the level of enjoyment that we have in our social life and our intimate relationships depends on the quality of our relationships, which is determined by our communication. So if we make one small change in our communication, that's going to affect everything. Because it's there, it's influencing, it's creating, it's shifting, it's changing, it's determining so much of our life. And I love that. It's so inspiring. And so I would hope people might leave with a sense of like, oh, I can do that. I could do that.
It doesn't have to be a huge transformation all at once. I like the way you were characterizing this as just a little bit.
That's right.
Because that little bit itself builds over time. And that's, again, entirely dependent on one's own choice to practice this, to open up and spend some time listening, exploring what that can be like.
Yeah, totally. So, if folks want to learn more, if folks like what they're hearing in our conversation and, want to check this out, I have a giveaway, a nice giveaway when folks join my newsletter. They get the introductory guided meditation series that I created with 6 guided meditations and a free ebook on contemplative practice. And so there's a really easy way to do that. Anyone who's listening who wants to stay in touch and check that out is to send a text message actually to the number 44222. And in that text message, just put the word guided, GUIDED, that one word guided to 44222. And then it'll ask for your email address and you'll get those free gifts and so forth. And I'm really also psyched that we've had this great pre-order. As you said, the book's coming out right now, in just a few days. And we've had this whole fun pre-order bonus where when people pre-order the book, they get like this guided meditation series and access to some of my online training courses with 10% Happier. And we were just found out able to extend the offer for another month. So anyone who decides to get the book, if you go to my website, which I think you mentioned already, was orenjsofer.com, orenjaysofer.com, you'll see the information there for how to get all those bonus gifts if you end up buying the book.
And for those who are listening to the podcast, you can find a link to that website and, of course, the book on the episode page for this episode. Oren, thank you very much for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Ten. This was fun.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.